Our first speaker today is Steve Ernst. He's been with us for 6, almost 7 years. He leads our consulting group here and has a BS in chemical engineering with over 25 years of chemical industry experience ranging from product development to managing complete regulatory programs. I know a lot of you already know who Steve is. And today he will be speaking to you about the new TSCA. So welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you everybody for coming out this year again. A lot of familiar faces, and those of you that are new, we appreciate you attending. As Amanda noted, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach this year. We're kind of starting in with the more specific functions that we've done in PACE, kind of looking at more of how to prepare a PMN for under the new Lautenberg Acts, or the new TSCA, as a lot of people have called it. The Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. So real briefly, get people kind of a background of why are we talking about TSCA. TSCA's been on the books for 40-some years. Why is this important now? Originally, TSCA was enabled in 1976. Probably a few of us maybe even remember that. Originally, TSCA was designed to regulate chemicals that pose an unreasonable risk of harm to human health or the environment prior to the release into the U.S. marketplace. TSCA looks at it from a commerce side. A chemical doesn't really exist as far as the EPA is concerned until you're looking at putting it into the marketplace. At that point in time, Congress felt there was no existing regulations which could control hazards of chemicals prior to their entry into the U.S. marketplace. We had regulations such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, OSHA, even to some degree FDA, but these all regulated chemicals after they were in the marketplace. They were regulating effects, regulating and restricting and controlling releases to the environment. So we really wanted to kind of get a first chance to regulate these prior to getting into the marketplace. It was intended to approach risks from chemicals in a rather holistic way. Again, not looking at maybe one single aspect of the chemical hazard or one specific market, but look at it from an entire risk approach, risk and hazard approach for the chemical entering the marketplace prior to being allowed in the marketplace. TSCA was designed to help develop information to increase our understanding about toxicity of chemicals and the risks they posed. This was going to originally apply to an existing list of some 62,000 chemical substances that they were going to grandfather in. That basically formed a list that we now call the TSCA inventory list, and then any new chemicals that were added as well. So originally EPA was supposed to go back and look at those 62,000 chemicals. But things didn't quite work out that way. There were a number of things under the original act that didn't work. And over the last 40 years, EPA and the chemical industry has been struggling with some of those restrictions. One of the first things that really didn't work well was test rules. EPA said they were given the power under TSCA to test chemicals. However, they had to pass a rule. And passing a rule in EPA is rather like passing a law. You have to promulgate it out there. You have to take comments. You have to address every single comment. You have to promulgate it again. So it ended up taking years. So by the time EPA could make a rule about a chemical, usually the marketplace had moved on and they'd wasted a lot of time. Section 5, which talks about new chemicals, which we'll kind of go into in more detail as we get into this, there's no requirement at all for supplying any health or exposure data. So you could submit a new chemical, the pre-market notification, without any data whatsoever. And EPA really didn't have the obligation to respond to you whether or not you were on the list or not. You just simply either dropped or you got a restriction. And there was no reasoning as to why they may have had those restrictions. Section 6 is another big change under Lautenberg. Section 6 is that section I was just talking about, the regulation of existing really failed to be effectively utilized. Because there was a least burdensome clause in the actual rule. It basically said EPA, to restrict a chemical, had to look at all the possible ways that it could control that risk and choose the least burdensome. Well, in 1991, EPA tried to regulate asbestos. And basically they went straight for banning asbestos. Well, we all are aware that asbestos is a hazardous chemical. It's certainly carcinogen, lots of risks associated with it. However, under the least burdensome rule, you can't go directly to banning that substance without looking at all the other forms of restrictions that you could have used prior to that. Unfortunately, when they did that, EPA went right to try to banning it. They said we need a least burdensome approach. EPA said, well, the only way I can do that is to show you that there's a positive outcome from us banning it. And unfortunately, they couldn't come up with good positive outcomes. They couldn't quantitate clean water, clean air. What's the quality of life that's improved by making a lake pure? So under that, they kind of lost that that ability to use Section 6 rules for regulating existing chemicals. And what ended up happening is EPA kind of backed away from the whole thing. Now, there's a few cases where they did manage to pass regulation on existing chemicals, but by and large, they really didn't go back and do what the original rule was designed to do, which was look at everything on the inventory and make sure it was safe. Section 8, if you're going to look at existing chemicals, what's your inventory? We don't really know how many of those things that are on the inventory that they grandfathered in are actually being sold in commerce. They gathered the list from a survey, but we don't know how many were being actually transferred in commerce. And there was a lot of issues with confidentiality. Under the existing TSCA, it was very easy for a new substance to claim confidentiality for most of the information. Simply checking a box. EPA really didn't validate those claims of confidentiality. This became issues later on because EPA uses that data internally, but yet it can't tell you what it's doing with that data because it's confidential, so there's a lot of conflicts there. So Lautenberg went back and changed a lot of these things. I kind of color-coded the headings because I think they fit together. They changed the Section 4 test rules. They now have the flexibility to require testing by order or consent agreement. So literally they can send you a letter and say, we require you to test, or we're going to restrict you. If you agree to that, you live under the consent order agreement. Section 5, well, now you can test. So under Section 5, they can require you to test under Section 4, and the EPA has to tell you what the determination of their evaluation is of your chemical, and they have to tell you why they determined that. Section 6, the existing chemicals section, completely revamped, almost totally rewritten. They got rid of the least burdensome restrictions. They require now a prioritization process. And when Congress actually wrote this, it wasn't EPA, but Congress actually wrote this, they actually wrote it in the form of EPA shall do this by this date. So they had to come up with the rules for prioritizing things on the list, and one of the things that they actually really spelled out is how they were going to determine which chemicals they were going to start with for prioritization. If you're a high-risk chemical, then you actually have to go through a risk evaluation, which is a long process under EPA rules right now. They're still trying to formulate how they're going to do these. The first 10 substances came out in January that they're working on. Most of those were from existing work plan chemicals, so they weren't a surprise to anybody because EPA chose to choose ones that they'd already started on. They knew the process was going to take so long that they wanted to start with ones they already had a running start on. So you're going to do all this work on existing chemicals, you better get the inventory straight. So they basically said, we're going to reset the inventory. If you're buying or manufacturing chemicals in the United States, basically the next year, you will need to validate every substance that you purchase that it is on the active inventory. Everybody who's a manufacturer has an obligation, if they manufactured it in the last 10 years, to notify EPA that it's positively on the inventory. If you're a processor, you can notify as well, just to make sure all your substances are on there. There's two different notification periods, but this is becoming a big issue when you start looking at all the import-export, where everything is coming from, who's doing what. Are your substances legal to sell? Will they be legal to sell by the time you want to ship them? Those sort of things. And they rewrote confidentiality. Now the CDI is preserved. You can still keep things confidential, but you have to do a lot of work now in justifying it, and EPA can ask you a lot more justification questions. As a matter of fact, if you're doing a PMN, every fourth one they're pulling out and reviewing for CDI justifications. And they'll come back and actually press you back for that information, whether or not it actually needs to be CDI. And one of the interesting things, if you're into regulatory law, like I am, I guess, is preemption. When and where TSCA as a federal program is going to take precedence over the state programs. Obviously, at the time the Lautenberg Act was passed, there was a senator from the state of California who was very adamant that the state rights should be more closely adhered to than the federal rights, so we had quite a bit of interest in preemption at that time. So when you're talking about a new chemical and how Lautenberg affects that, when you're bringing a new chemical to market, where is Lautenberg going to come into effect? Well, this is actually a schematic of what EPA goes through when you receive your information. Now, I know it's kind of small, but I'm using their actual diagram. They receive it. By day 2, they're looking at the chemistry. Days 8 and 12, CSSR, where they're actually going through chemical risk and safety assessments, SAT meeting, where they're if they can't find the data, they're modeling the data by day 13, and then they come to the focus meeting. So this is the actual process they use. Well, when they enacted Lautenberg, a lot of rules had to be changed within EPA. So that box in red down there is one I actually added. EPA sort of took advantage of a loophole in the law, and they couldn't keep up with the IPMNs on the 90-day cycle that they had to by law, so they had to find a way of postponing that 90 days. So essentially what they did is they called you up and asked you to ask them to postpone it. You can ask to postpone your PMN while you gather data. So they took advantage of this, and they did this multiple times for some people, 4, 5, 6 months. So some TMNs ended up taking almost 9 months to process because they kept using this reset of the clock. Otherwise, they have to do this whole process within 90 days, including all their modeling. So under the old system of pre-manufacturing, notice had 4 possible outcomes. A pause. They could ask you to pause the system while they evaluated it. A SNR, a significant new use restriction, which is basically a restriction. It could be anything from labeling, new PPE, to test data, whatever needed they felt to handle a risk. A drop, which is what everybody wanted. You submitted your PMN, you didn't hear anything for 90 days, it went on the inventory, dropped on the inventory. Or a standard review, which is a more complex review, and it took up the whole 90 days and frequently additional 90 days. Those were typical with some very high-risk chemicals. So after Lautenberg went into effect, most of the existing language in this section was retained. They kept most of Section 5, but there was a number of things that more importantly changed. EPA now has to give a public determination of the notification submitted. So said prior they didn't have to do any of that. They just either dropped on the list or they gave you a SNR. Now they have to send you a letter of determination, which explains exactly why they did it, and they publish it in the CFRs. What they've been doing lately is doing them in batches. So they'll actually have your notification, your determination done, and then they will kind of wait to release a bunch of them onto the CFRs all at once, and actually goes into the Code of Federal Regulations on all your chemicals. And when they restrict something, they actually have to give a reason for it. They can't just make something up. They actually have to have a reason. They have to tell it, and they have to tell it publicly, which means, therefore, it legally has to be defensible. So that's kind of an important point that a lot of my lawyer friends that are in the regulatory law really like to know about, is that now it's public and they can defend it. It's no longer a drop process. Under the new system, there are basically 3 determinations EPA can make. Substance can present an unreasonable risk, in which case you're done. You're kind of restricted. They're going to write a rule specifically about your compound and tell you why you can't sell it. More frequently, you get an insufficient or may present unreasonable risk or substantial production exposure volume restrictions. Well, in that case, it's more of a yield. You may have the ability to sell your product, you may not. You may not be able to live with the restriction. If they put a restriction that keeps you from discharging any more than 4 parts per billion to surface waters, and your chemical is supposed to be used as a water treatment compound, that's going to be a really tough restriction to live with. but sometimes it's no more than adding PPE requirements to that. I've seen those restrictions come through as well. And one everyone likes to see, the green light, your substance is not likely to present a risk. Once you get your determination letter, you're good to go. So even though that's a 90-day review period, they give you a determination letter prior to that, you don't have to wait the full 90 days. So all of these changes caused this huge backlog that required EPA to kind of look at things differently. They had to look at how they were doing their processes. They eventually started to catch up about the beginning of this summer. Now they're back to what they say is a standard review time, if you count 300 backlogged IPMNs. So that's catching up pretty good. So how have those IPMNs, which we've done since Lautenberg come into effect, how has EPA actually ruled on those? Well, since June of 2016, EPA has looked at about 513 PMNs, or microbial activity notices, or significant use notices. And of those, 102 they passed through. They were good to go with unreasonable risk. But about 255 fell into that insufficient information category. And only 3 were given may present unreasonable risk. So only 3 out of 513. So you have a low percentage of falling or failing ultimately, but 153 were withdrawn. So a lot of people looked at that and those new criteria and got those phone calls from the EPA asking for more data and can you pause your PMN while we look at new data, and they decided to withdraw their PMNs from that process and start over to get the proper information. So whether or not we should count those 153 as just gone or in insufficient information is probably a good guess. The insufficient information documentations or the determination letters that were received really point out something though. EPA is really using their new authority under the Lautenberg Act to add additional testing requirements. So they can restrict you for any number of reasons beyond what we were used to seeing previously. An example is a lot of powdered materials now receive acute inhalation toxicity requests. So they hold you up, give you a determination letter that says you can't sell more than 100,000 kilograms of this unless you do acute inhalation toxicity testing. Well, the OECD 403, which is the short-term toxicity testing, runs about $10,000. If you have to do a long-term test, you can multiply that by 10. So you can figure that this is now suddenly becoming a huge factor in new chemicals coming through and the volumes that we can actually put onto the market because EPA has more authority under Lautenberg. And why are they using this authority? Well, they really look at a lot of this data not just from the standpoint of is the substance going onto the market, what's the risk now? EPA is planning ahead for when they may have to look at this for prioritization and maybe a further risk assessment. So they're asking for data now that they may need later. So under the Section 4 test rules, consent order may require development of new information relating to chemical substances mixtures if the EPA determines that the information is necessary. And they said, well, we would consider it necessary to review a new notice under Section 5 or to perform an evaluation under Section 6 and to implement any requirement imposed by a rule or consent order for 5 or 6 and also for export. If they think you're exporting something that may have a high degree of risk, they're going to apply Section 4 test rules as well. So EPA no longer has the obligation to use a least burdensome testing requirement or restriction. Now they're going to require more data. They want to do that to prepare for the prioritization and hazard assessments which are going to come in the following years. This year will be fairly straightforward as they get through the first 10 on the prioritization work list, but after that they're going to start delving into more and more chemicals. Knowing these things, looking at a new chemical substance, what do we recommend for preparing for the fastest and most optimal results when you file a PMN under the new Lautenberg Act? There's a number of things that we've done with our clients, and we've had some good successes with that, so we wanted to share those with people. First one, very obviously, is prepare. Have all the test data, use data, release data, handling information, and disposal information in your hands. You're going to need it, provide it. Make sure you start asking your production people, your production facilities to provide it as soon as possible. As soon as you determine you want to go and do a PMN. Know your substance. Do your substance research. EPA loves models. Because most people weren't providing data, they developed whole sets of tools of models. They're very nice tools, but they are very conservative. EPA is a mandate to protect health and environment. So those models are going to not give you very advantageous results unless you can give them good starting points. So look at those models first. If you don't have test data, run the models yourself. See where you're going to come out. If you can't do those models, or if it's not something that you feel comfortable doing, that's obviously something somebody like PACE can do for you and help you with. Know your uses. Now, this is a big thing that's coming out of the hazard assessments after prioritization, is uses. EPA's been given a mandate to look at all possible uses, and that includes known uses and anticipated uses. We don't really know what that means yet, so the better you can define your uses up front, the better chance you're going to have of getting a good assessment from them. Otherwise, they will start pulling their own uses. Know what you're going to use it for. I mean, a lot of times when you're a manufacturer, you may not even look at that. You may look at maybe one use, that's the market, that's what I'm selling it for, but it gets distributed downstream. They consider now distributed uses as well as your primary principal uses. So you should be aware of what those are before you submit. You know, when, where, how much specifically is being used for what, is if you can get that information, really helps. Avoid generalized uses. So when EPA has to look at your product and you've said you're going to use it for a general purpose solvent, the EPA is going to assume that that is going to be exposed to nearly every human being on the United States. So general uses, wide dispersive uses, only if you need to. If that's your market, great. But if it's not, don't add it on there just to maybe have that as a future use, because it may restrict you in where you can sell your products. And know where it isn't going to be used. Don't add things, uses, when you know it's not going to be used in that case, because EPA will, a lot of times these are additive. They have a model, an algorithm where they add up the different bad factors, if it's fate or if it's environmental exposure or if it's human exposure, and all of those add together for a final assessment. So if it's not going to be used for a specific use and that use may lead to high risk, then you don't need it on your PMN. Be sure to specify how you handle your substances as a waste. Remember, this is EPA. They're very concerned with waste. It's one of their other mandates. Is EPRA, hazardous waste, all that. So they want to know, and they want to see it in your PMN, how you are prepared to handle the waste. Not just at your manufacturing facility, not just for your distributors, but your formulators, and also your packaging as well. Don't forget about the packaging. So in these particular cases, your EPA likes terminal uses or terminal waste handling. So you don't want to tell EPA that, hey, we're just going to throw the drums in the trash. You want to look at how can we recycle those drums, and if we can't recycle them, how are we going to get them to a terminal waste facility, meaning they're going to incinerate them. Use this modeling software, EpiSuite, EcoSARS, QSAR Toolbox, EFAS, Environmental Fate Estimates, ChemSteer, to really prepare to help tell a story about your product. So you're going to have some amount of data. Use these models to fill in data where you can't test, and then tell your substance story. And this is probably the most important. It's going to wrap up all of those items. Use an open format report to explain the information you've put in the PMN. Now, if any of you have done a PMN, it's in electronic format. The EPA does it all through CDX. And you have very small spaces to provide information. However, they give you unlimited space to upload files. So prepare a report, explain everything about how your product is used, model data, test data, put it all together, explain the hazards, exposures, typically formulated, stored, shipped, benefits over current existing products. In short, use your prepared information and write a story for the EPA because they really want to know how it's used. tie all the information together in one neat package, one neat report. It may be your opinion, but it's important. It gives more information than the PMN. It limits EPA's assumptions, because EPA will assume the worst unless you tell them otherwise. It also puts boundaries on their models, so they can start modeling things with maybe not every human in the United States, but maybe only those that are likely to use your product. They won't do that unless you tell them that information, and this is the only place where you're going to get a chance to do that. It also adds reality to the process. Otherwise, EPA sometimes will end up modeling situations that are completely unrealistic, and you'll be stuck living with those model results. So tie it all up in a neat package. So we kind of talked about the history of TSCA, the Lautenberg updates, the effects of Lautenberg on new chemicals, and really, more importantly, the tips for notification. Now, we're probably going to go into more detail with Scott's presentation on how we do those sort of assessments and how we write those reports. But this is an example of a case where doing assessments fits into an existing regulatory scheme, and EPA really likes this particular model. Even if it's not as in-depth as some of their other assessments, it gives them a good starting point, and it really helps the PMN process get to a conclusion that's more likely to support you in your uses.